right. Hello, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to the Elliott Bay Book Company. My name is Sean. I'm a bookseller here. Tonight I am very excited, very pleased to be welcoming you to our readings room for this very special evening in partnership with Red May, where we will get to hear Stuart Schrader discuss his latest book, Blue Power, How Police Organize to Protect and Serve Themselves. If you didn't already know, Red May is a month-long spree of red arts, red theory, and red politics based here in Seattle. You gather, in bookstores, in movie theaters, in bars, in parks, cafes, alleys, and auditoriums to share in discussion and plot ways forward toward a world in common, a world beyond capitalism. Phil did want me to shout out that tomorrow at the Beacon, Red May will be hosting a screening of State of Siege. Stuart will be in attendance for that. It's at 7. The Beacon is awesome if you haven't been there. I'm sure most of you have, but please do check that out. And then on Tuesday at Town Hall, also at 7, there will be a talk, Ice Age Policing. And that is not the geological. Okay. Anyway, a few things before we get started here. If at any point anyone needs to use the restroom, it is upstairs in the cafe, and the code today is 8737. We do have an elevator to get upstairs, so please just let me know if you would prefer to use that. The cafe does want me to start telling people that the cafe closes at 9, and it's their bathroom, not our bathroom. So if you need to use the bathroom after 9, please go to Big Oddfellows next door. If you tell them that you attended the event at Elliott Bay, they will give you the code to their bathroom and let you use it. After the stage portion of the evening, there will be a signing in the back, and for that signing, you'll want to just form a single line along the wall here. You can purchase your book from me, and then you can get it signed. You may have already purchased your book, but please let's try and do one line for both signing and purchasing. You will also find this month's reading schedule back there, and if you're interested, you can subscribe to our newsletter by scanning the QR code on the back of that schedule. Our events coordinator, Sophia, works very, very hard on the newsletter, and she loves it when people subscribe. I love making Sophia happy, and wouldn't you love to make Sophia happy? It's very simple. Just subscribe to the newsletter. So Stuart Schrader is an associate professor of history at Johns Hopkins University, where he is the director of the Chloe Center for the Critical Study of Racism, Immigration, and Colonialism. He is also the author of Badges Without Borders, How Global Counterinsurgency Transformed American Policing, and he lives in Brooklyn. Stuart will be joined in conversation tonight by Teresa Rocha-Beardall. Teresa is an associate professor of sociology at the University of Washington. Her research bridges the areas of race, law, inequality, policing, family policing, indigeneity, and tribal sovereignty. Her research has appeared in Criminology, Sociology of Race and Ethnicity, the Columbia Journal of Race and Law, as well as the American Indian Culture and Research Journal, among other venues. She is currently working on her first book, examining the political economy of policing in race-class subjugated communities, and conducting a 3-year study funded by the William T. Grant Foundation, exploring how tribal sovereignty can be leveraged to protect Native youth and families and the child welfare system. So, without any further ado from me, thank you all so much for being here. And now, please join me in welcoming Stuart and Teresa.
Hi everybody, thanks so much for coming here on this beautiful day, evening. I appreciate it. It's great to see a bunch of new faces as well as some familiar faces. So I wanted to, before I get started, say a few thanks. Thank you to Phil and Red May for putting together this event and all of the Red May events. I'll be speaking at 2 more in the next 2 days. And thank you also to Elliott Bay Books. What a wonderful space. This is really awesome. I'm so glad to be here. And thank you to Teresa for this conversation, for Dan for hooking us up together to have this conversation. And again, thank you to all of you. So what I thought I would do is read a couple of pages from the very beginning of the book, but before I do that, I just wanted to mention, so there are some images here. I'm not going to refer to the images, just let them kind of like wash over you. These are images that I came across in my research. A few of them are actually in the book, but most of them are not because I couldn't, they wouldn't let me just put hundreds of pictures of cops rioting in the book. But there's some other images there as well. So it kind of gives you a feel for the types of materials that I used in the research process. And if you do have a question about something up there, obviously I'd be happy to speak about it. Okay. Cops were pissed off. They felt disrespected by protesters, underpaid by mayors, and abused by commanding officers. Forced to accept worsening working conditions without complaint, cops were dejected, fragmented, and disorganized. At the national level, they lacked an obvious way to mount a cohesive response, vocalize their political positions, and assert their indispensability. If Americans wanted to take power away from the police, many cops felt maybe they did not deserve police protection at all. One officer crystallized these frustrations while testifying before Congress. Jerome Dudzik was a leader of a nascent police union in Milwaukee, and he had come to Washington to demand that Congress protect police from unfair labor practices, particularly where overtime pay was concerned. He was direct, if a bit contorted. "Gentlemen, we are getting stronger and more unified," he declared. "The probability of a nationwide police walkout could be a possibility." Police certainly had leverage, but whether they were as able to use it as Dudzik suggested was another question. The year was 1970. The last time police had mounted a real strike was 1919. Then, Boston's police commissioner refused to allow officers to join the American Federation of Labor, spurring over 1,000 cops to decline to report for work. 9 people died in the street violence, fires, and looting that ensued. Police had been wary of even threatening unlawful strikes and slowdowns ever since. Labor unions steered clear of cops, seeing them largely as protectors of the bosses and the status quo, while cops mistrusted organized labor, believing it was nothing but a den of pinkos. Without organized bottom-up power, top-down power filled the void. The police organization most actively involved in lobbying legislators in Washington did not speak for rank-and-file officers. The International Association of Chiefs of Police represented their bosses. Its greatest accomplishment, the 1968 Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act, signed by President Lyndon Johnson, enabled the federal government to offer fiscal assistance to police agencies through the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration. But this new outfit's focus on research and reform had little to offer cops on the beat. A new generation was realizing that if regular cops wanted change, they would have to accomplish it themselves. In 1967, the president of the Detroit Police Officers Association, Carl Parcell, broke the taboo on police strikes when he organized officers to call out sick en masse. John Cassis, leader of the New York City Patrolmen's Benevolent Association, had organized an effective campaign to convince voters to strike down civilian review of police misconduct, and his successors would follow in his footsteps to become national figures shaping the profession far beyond the Big Apple. In Baltimore, the local Fraternal Order of Police was contending with a chapter of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees to represent cops at the bargaining table, and each was trying to outdo the other through political appeals beyond the workplace. A few San Francisco cops, calling themselves the Bluecoats, remade their Officers Association into one of California's most fearsome political organizations, able to get what it wanted from the state legislature if local officials refused to cave. And when Parcell could not get a flight to Washington, the Milwaukee Professional Policemen's Protective Association took the case to Congress, putting Dudzik and his colleague Robert Kleesmet briefly into the spotlight. A few months after their appearance, John Harrington, national president of the Fraternal Order of Police, brought as many as 3,500 cops, this is actually the picture of this, 3,500 cops from 44 states to Washington to rally on the steps of the Capitol. Police political power trickled at first, but it soon became a torrent. Within a couple decades, police had become well enough organized to be able to command resources and respect from Congress, the White House, and city halls and state houses across the country. They did so without a single national police union, though not for lack of trying. The balance of power within the profession shifted too. If chiefs and commanders wanted to survive, they had to accommodate or accede to rank-and-file power. Cops grew unafraid to wield this power openly, uproariously, and sometimes illegally. After beginning to demonstrate, strike, and riot to obtain contracts in the 1960s and 70s, Police redeployed these same tactics in subsequent decades in response to perceived slights, including rare punishments for misconduct. Elected officials who tried to pacify angry police by affording them generous compensation, as well as grievance procedures, found that once emboldened, police were not easily tamed. Their militancy reaped rewards from both municipal governments and Washington. Money was respect quantified. Respect was a proxy for power. So that's how the book starts. And the book traces a kind of arc of municipal struggles and the effort successful in many cities by police to gain political power at the municipal level. When they can't get what they want at the municipal level, they start pivoting to the state house, to the state legislature. Cops in San Francisco, who I write about, were pioneers of this strategy. And so that transformation happens from the 60s into the 70s, and then going into the 80s and the 1990s, police figured out how to gain power in Congress. The initial effort that I mentioned in the beginning of the book in 1970 to gain power in Congress was not really successful. But what changed was that the composition of the Senate and the House developed in such a way that police-friendly legislators started to gain particularly powerful positions in subcommittees. One of them was a guy you may have heard of named Joe Biden. He was really interested in helping police. He came into office as a kind of new type of Northern Democrat. The guy he had defeated to become the senator in Delaware was a sort of classic Cold War liberal. Throughout the 60s, even into the 70s, he was still kind of ranting about Stalin. And Joe Biden was like, who cares about Stalin? Let's talk about street crime. And that transformation really enabled police to gain a foothold in Congress, and that led to the 1994 crime bill, which was still to this day the largest crime bill. And even as police were gaining power at these increasing scales, they were still maintaining their fearsome power at the municipal level in towns and cities across the country. And so toward the end of the book, I kind of spend a lot of time in New York City and show the kind of relationship between these kind of municipal and federal levels of power. Maybe the one other thing I'll say just by way of introduction is that the book is about the political power of police. To emphasize the political power which mostly is wielded behind closed doors in, offices at the State House, in collective bargaining, etc. To emphasize that is not to de-emphasize or ignore what I would call the operational power of police. Instead, it's just to say that I think many of us in this room have a pretty good understanding of the operational power of police. Over the past decade or 2 decades, scholars, journalists, activists have done a really great job of alerting us to what police do in the streets on a daily basis, from stopping a motorist on the side of the street to controlling protests and even engaging in covert forms of surveillance and so forth. So that operational power of police is essential, it's irreducible, but I think we have a pretty good understanding of it, whereas we have a less robust understanding of the kind of behind-the-scenes way that police engage in political power in self-interested ways. And so this book tries to shift that focus and show that what makes police different from other types of, say, public sector unions is that they're able to marry their political power with their operational power. So when they don't get their way behind closed doors, they oftentimes will take to the streets. They will protest, they will riot, they will intimidate elected officials, intimidate protesters, etc. So other public sector unions, of course, can strike. They can, often not legally, but they can rally, they can demonstrate. But it's really police who, because of their endowment with the means of using violence, that they're able to bring these two forms of power together in a unique and deeply consequential way that the book argues has shaped our politics in this country at every scale from the 1960s all the way through to the present. And so I hope by pivoting our attention to that political power, we get a different understanding of what's been going on. In a certain way, when I conceived of this book, it was almost going to be a kind of history of the past 50 or 60 years with police kind of popping up and getting their way at every turn. It isn't exactly just a history of the past several decades. It's much more focused. But you will see that in the book there are just so many episodes in history that may be familiar episodes that you've read many books about already or maybe experienced yourselves. But I hope to show that in fact just out of view, police were engaged in manipulative tactics trying to shape the outcomes of well-known political episodes in our history, and we can certainly talk about some of them. So with that, I will stop.
Stuart. I think that's not enough. So I just want to say thank you, Stuart, for being here, for writing the book, and Dan, again, also for putting us together. And also for all of my UW students who are in the audience. You all are fantastic. I teach a sociology of policing class at UW. And the students, just for those of you who don't spend all day, every day on campus, just for you to know that these are things that young people are thinking very critically about and are making room in their course schedules to be able to take this class even when they're not going on to study it as like a full-time sort of area of research. So a little bit about, for the audience, and also maybe for you, Stuart, because you might not know this. So I come to the study of police labor power through sort of the side door, where I'm trained as a lawyer and a sociologist, and my dissertation work began with what do people do when they're harmed by police? All the myriad ways that they engage it, they refuse it, they ignore it, they try to sue a city, they try to find evidence to prove that it happened, all of these different things that people did. And the arrows always went back to, through the interviews, the arrows always went back to the ways they were stymied from actually being able to get redress or reform or all of the things that maybe many of us in this room hope will happen when there is justifiable evidence beyond a shadow of a doubt that officers have done horrible, heinous things to people, that something should be done. And they would go to great lengths to get the evidence, and the city would settle for a cheap price so that it wouldn't, the full files wouldn't be available to the public. And at every turn, the police union was, of course, orchestrating all of these things. They were orchestrating what internal affairs did and didn't do. They would orchestrate who was in internal affairs and when to rotate officers there. So that they wouldn't have any past knowledge, so that when they were subpoenaed to court that they could say that they didn't know what was going on in the past. So I didn't set out to study police labor unions, is the long story short. But I got there through the way that people continue to run up against closed doors. And this kind of mirage of justice. When the state harms you, what do you do, and what happens in the end? So my questions kind of come from that angle, and I will just kind of jump into some of the, I think, really interesting things that for those of you who haven't read it, and most of you probably haven't because it's like hot off the presses, I want Stuart to talk about some of the, I think, really kind of cool high points that I hope draw you in. Okay, so the part that you just read opens us up with this sort of like, cops are pissed off, like they are almost like abused and ignored, and they take to Washington to try to get some relief and attention.
Of course, what they're not saying in that venue and other venues is all the ways that they are very, very busy manipulating the public, who, as taxpayers, we pay salaries, pensions, benefits, often in perpetuity for officers. And they're also not talking about the ways they're manipulating and subverting power within the department as well. And so you give us, I mean, he takes us across the country, across like decades. There are so many amazing examples of this. And I'm hoping that you can talk about a few of the escalating tactics that officers were using, both to refuse the public and also to refuse command inside of the department simultaneously.
Yeah. Well, so as I said, I make this distinction between command, between chiefs who are running departments and rank and file officers. And I think that we typically tend to, when we speak about the police, we typically tend to speak in a kind of monolithic tone, as if police departments are unitary. And what I found in this research is that that is often not true. And in the 1960s, because of the urban rebellions, because of social movements, the anti-war movement, civil rights and black power, feminist movement, there was a lot of social turmoil that cops were being called upon to respond to, and they were not doing so effectively. There was also increasing violent crime, and police chiefs wanted to answer demands from the public, from elected officials, to kind of take control over the situation. And so, in many cases, what they proposed was reform measures, and oftentimes these entailed new types of training, raising the standards to make it so that when cops were hired, they had better levels of education, et cetera, et cetera. So the reform trend was led by the chiefs. Rank and file officers were not thrilled about reform. To some degree, they felt like it was an accusation that they were not up to the task of fighting crime and controlling protests and so forth. They also didn't like having their work routines changed. One example is, before this period, many police patrolled during the daylight hours. When do you think most crime occurs? Not during the daylight hours, right? So it wasn't like some genius scientists revealed that in fact crime was occurring more when it was dark out. But police chiefs started to say, okay, we got to look at the evidence and maybe change the way we deploy our resources. Officers who had been patrolling during the daylight hours for their entire careers were not happy about being told, you have to now patrol at night. You have to, be away from your family or whatever, and change your whole routine. So these types of changes were characteristic of this period, and so this kind of internal clash within departments where officers didn't like the changes and reforms that the chiefs were bringing to the table went alongside or hand in hand with a broader rejection of this kind of social turmoil that was going on. The Supreme Court, as you may know, during the 1960s made a number of decisions to protect the rights of criminal suspects and defendants. For example, Miranda rights, which we've all seen on TV. You get your rights read to you when you're arrested. That was new in the 1960s. So police thought that this was giving quote-unquote criminals license. It was giving them all this leverage against the police, against the courts. So they rejected those types of political and social transformations, and of course they rejected civil rights. They rejected, in many cases, desegregation. They rejected pushes for civilian review of police misconduct. So all of this came together to power their energetic multi-city mobilization to gain greater control over their working conditions, which they were able to do through the collective bargaining process in many cases. And what happened was that cities and states changed their laws in the 1960s to enable collective bargaining of public sector workers. So teachers, sanitation workers, et cetera, they all started to gain the right to unionize around the same time. And police kind of rode that wave to sign new legal agreements that would allow them to collectively bargain. And the really interesting thing that I found in the research, and I suggested in what I just read, is that in many cases, the most kind of vehement tactics that they took against command, against mayors, etc., came even before they gained contracts. It was like, we're going to go on a walkout because the city is reluctant to give us a contract. So what happened was that soon enough, in most cities, they did eventually gain contracts. They gained grievance procedures. In some cases, they gained arbitration rights. All the things that other public sector unions had access to. And there were a number of sociologists and labor experts and lawyers who were writing at the time, and they were saying, well, yes, police are doing all this wild stuff, but once we give them contracts, they're going to calm down. They'll relax. They'll become just like every other union. They just negotiate a new contract every few years, and occasionally they might put out a press release saying that they're displeased with the terms of the contract, but they're going to relax. And this movement of blue power is not my term. It's a term from the era, and Carl Parcell, the guy I mentioned from the Detroit Police Officers Association, he disseminates this term. He is very explicit that it's against black power. There's no secret about how reactionary it is. But the analysis at the time said that they would basically be pacified once they got their contracts. And so if I stopped the book in the mid-70s and I followed the kind of existing bit of scholarship that came out at that time, I would have said, well, they were going to chill out and that's the end of the story. But of course, I lived through the 2000s. I lived in New York City. I lived through the intense fights that the police union in New York City, the Police Benevolent Association, put up against Mayor Bill de Blasio. And so I knew that it was not the case that police, once they got their contracts, calmed down. And so the book really shows that from the period in the 70s when they get their contracts, they continue to wage these really intense battles by striking, by calling out sick en masse, by working to rules. So for example, I have an example in the book of, in Baltimore, there was a police strike in 1974. And officers said, well, not all of us are going to walk out. Some of us are going to follow the law to the closest minute detail. So our job is to turn in any lost property that we come across in our patrolling. If they found a penny on the street, they would pick it up and say, this is lost property, and we have to turn it in, and we have to file a report and create all this paperwork. And so it really gummed up the whole system. So there's lots of examples like this of police manipulating their operations again in order to get what they want politically.
I'm so glad you brought up the penny. The penny is a really great example of these kind of small and big ways that Stewart is able to kind of track across time about how police are slowing down their own work, often by doing their work, and the consequences for then public safety, however we might imagine it, as members of the public. I want to just sort of reiterate the point for all of us in the room is that in the book, you do a really good job of showing us kind of the fits and starts and the fragmentation of police labor organizing across time and place. And I'm wondering if you could help us to draw, because you draw this distinction in the book between like what organized labor looks like and what the fraternal order of police looks like, and what
what are those two things? And how are they in conversation? And what happens maybe in Maryland? And why that matters for how we understand policing today.
Yeah, so I use the term police union to encompass lots of different types of organizations and associations. And I actually follow the lead of basically a textbook that's called something like Police Political Power, like how to use it. I can't remember what it is. But they say, look, there's lots of different terms. There's the Fraternal Order of Police, there's the blah, blah, blah association, the benevolent, blah, blah, blah. Who cares? Just call them all unions, because basically at the end of the day, what they're trying to do is negotiate contracts, file grievances, get into arbitration so they can get arbitration awards to their liking, etc. But it was the case originally that there was great skepticism, as I mentioned, among police of organized labor. And from the other side, organized labor was skeptical of police. And the organizations that that become police unions, most of them have no history with organized labor. So the Fraternal Order of Police, the benevolent associations, etc., Police Officers Association, like in Detroit, San Francisco, they start out as credit unions. They start out as kind of insurance organizations to, help families, widows, etc. They're social clubs. They're drinking clubs for cops. So when public sector unionization becomes legal, these pre-existing organizations that have nothing to do with the labor movement adopt some of the features of the labor movement. And some of them say, maybe it would make sense for us to join in with organized labor. But again, because there was so much skepticism and so much mutual hostility, the cops were deeply anti-communist. And then on the organized labor side, a lot of these guys literally were like, we went on strike 2 years ago, and you guys had your batons and you were beating us over the head. So why would we trust you to join together with us? And there were some police union officials who really worked hard to try to overcome that antagonism or animosity. And I talk in the book about an effort in the 1970s to actually form one national police union. And the idea was that it would be able to speak with one unified voice in Washington. It would be able to negotiate kind of relatively equal contracts across all the cities and states. Ultimately, it failed. But the firefighters across the country, something like 85% of firefighters all belong to the same union. So it wasn't a totally crazy idea to think that cops could do the same. But one of the things that prevented that national police union from coming into existence was the disparity among police. So cops in like Connecticut or Massachusetts, the Northeast, where they were paid pretty well, they were like, wait, we're going to be in the same union with cops in like Alabama and Louisiana? They get paid so little. Is that going to mean that our pay will go down? And I think that mentality of like kind of a zero-sum mentality, but also just the idea that like we're never going to try to raise the floor, we're only going to be fearful of the ceiling coming down, I think really speaks to the fundamental distinction that I would draw between the police union movement and organized labor. Organized labor is founded on a principle of solidarity, and police do not extend solidarity beyond their own profession. And that just comes up over and over and over again. And so in the Baltimore police strike in 1974, it actually started because other city workers went on strike, sanitation workers and other workers. And the Baltimore police were actually in the same union. They were all part of AFSCME at the time. And so when the other workers went on strike, they decided to go out on strike. And it basically blew up in their face. No spoilers, but AFSCME does not represent the Baltimore police anymore. the Fraternal Order of Police swooped in and was able to gain representation of the police. But the real question that strike put on the table was a question of whether the police union would work alongside and in concert with other workers in the city and join together and kind of use their collective power for mutual benefit. And it didn't pan out that way, and that was kind of a breaking point where after that moment, organized labor and the police union movement, although there still are some entanglements, and there are also efforts by activists to break those entanglements to the present, but they're minimal. They're really minimal. In general, organizations like the Fraternal Order of Police, which is really, really big and has kind of national reach, although it in various cities and states operates like a union, it really disclaims any relationship with labor.
Okay, so race and anti-blackness. I'll let him drink some water. Race and anti-blackness permeate the stories that we read about in the book. And as you said, Stuart, the kind of introduction and imposition, and I think maybe the staying power of blue power as a phrase in its response to not black power was really profound throughout the chapters. And then you take us to San Francisco, to the Bluecoats. Can you help us to understand who the Bluecoats are, why they mattered, and then how this idea of blue power then becomes both a shield and a weapon for all kinds of reform, race-related and otherwise?
Yeah. So I think like this photo is actually I think it's a black police officer at a protest. So another thing that was happening in this period at the beginning of the era of police unionization as we know it today was that police departments were integrating. And many cities did already have some black police officers, but there was a new, younger generation of more militant black police officers. Many of them saw in themselves a relationship to the civil rights movement, even, I wouldn't say black power, but in some cases, black nationalist and kind of cultural nationalist ideologies informed how they thought, how they spoke, how they dressed, how they engaged with others. And so the real question was, will police departments, where there are, in basically all of them, there are a lot of older white racist cops who don't want young new black cops, will they allow the hiring and then even promotion of these recruits and new officers? And because of the new whole regime of civil rights law and equal opportunity law that had come into being in the 1960s, there were challenges both, there were challenges to the old guard, sticking to their guns and preventing the hiring and promotion of new officers. They couldn't just be so explicit and bigoted as they had been in the past. Because if they were, they would get sued. And so in city after city after city, this did actually happen. New organizations, which were oftentimes quite small, of black police officers, would file lawsuits against the city because their officers were not getting promoted, or recruits were just not getting hired, they were failing tests over and over again, etc. So the Bluecoats are a really interesting organization. So the Bluecoats were a young, multiracial group of officers in San Francisco who basically took over the San Francisco Police Officers Association. And their view was that the police department in San Francisco ran on patronage. Basically, who you knew was what mattered to getting a job. some black officers had been able to get jobs and even get some promotions because they had connections with elected officials, the mayor, etc. But when the Bluecoats came in, they said, let's get rid of all patronage, including the kind of patronage that had allowed some black officers to be hired. They basically said, we want to be totally colorblind. And of course, if you know anything about the history of racial liberalism and colorblindness, it has often been a vehicle or mechanism for new forms of discrimination. And so when they removed what they saw as the kind of patronage methods for hiring black officers, they claimed it was going to mean fairness. But probably it's no great surprise for me to tell you that new black officers who were trying to get hired, get promoted, had a really hard time. And so they sued. And there ended up being this fight between the Black Police Officers Association in San Francisco and the Bluecoats. The Bluecoats were like, no, we're colorblind. We're not racist. It's not our fault that you're not getting promoted. We're actually being fair. What you're asking for is patronage. But the lawsuit, of course, provided extensive data, as these lawsuits always do, to show that in fact discrimination was persisting nevertheless. And so I think one of the really important takeaways from this is that kind of both sides in this fight, and this happened in many, many places, they learned how to engage in political appeals, to kind of mobilize constituencies. They learned how to engage in legal battles, go to court. They learned how to manipulate data so that it was potentially useful for their claims about what discrimination looked like. So all of these kind of lessons that they gained in the process of fighting over integration of police departments proved really, really useful for these organizations as they continued to engage in all of the other aspects of blue power. I say in the book that it really sharpened the blade of blue power because the Bluecoats, they had never seen the inside of a courtroom until the lawsuit. They had never tried to collate statistical data about how the department worked. So this ultimately became quite useful to them. And I think the story, if we come up to the present, in many, many cities across the country, police departments are well integrated. For example, in New York City, there are more non-white police than white police in the largest police department in the country. But the department's ability to promote officers of color up the ranks has been severely limited. It changed a little bit under Eric Adams, but then there were other problems that arose. And the police unions, particularly the Police Benevolent Association in New York City, but in general, many police unions, they still remain mostly white. So even though at the kind of patrol rank, departments have integrated, it still remains the case that the kind of hierarchies that control the departments are much less integrated.
And I appreciate in the book too, you tell us that really every loss is not a loss, it's a training ground. It's a training ground, exactly as you said. It puts cops into courtrooms. Again, as you said, statistical analyses. They're also become marketing, ad campaigns, and they become really successful at doing this. And then also their courting and refusal of elected officials in being able to sign on and or endorse candidates. So the wide variety of things that they're learning throughout this process, I think really coalesces how blue power kind of moves from this multiplicity and fragmentation into something that is huge.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I'm gonna have two more questions really quickly. I want us to talk about civilian oversight.
there's a lot of different moments and opportunities when communities are pushing back and fighting back. But civilian oversight is a particular kind of national call for reform. Often there's an assumption that if we just had more of us analyzing what they're doing, perhaps we'd be able to figure out what is just and unjust. But civilian oversight has a long history with blue power.
Yeah.
What is that history, and what can it help us to understand about it as a reform or not today?
Yeah, I mean, I think that civilian review is no panacea, but it still is something that the police unions are opposed to. Just last week, the Police Benevolent Association in New York City filed suit against the CCRB in the city. I mean, the details of that are somewhat complicated, but they still are antagonistic to civilian review. And I think that, this is one place where chiefs and rank and file officers actually, I think, have seen eye to eye. Because the implication of civilian review is that police departments can't discipline themselves, can't police themselves, that they need some kind of outside oversight rather than trusting the internal expertise. And they will always say, we wouldn't let civilians investigate crimes, as if cops are good at doing that. Why would we let civilians tell us how we should do our jobs, right? And so civilian review really started to gain a lot of momentum in the 1960s. It was widely, if you read the police literature from the time, it was widely condemned as basically a communist plot. It was like, as literally as if Moscow was trying to dismantle police departments through the vehicle of civilian review. I mean, it was quite ridiculous. I mean, if only. But yeah, it gained over time. It gained some. There were some developments of civilian review in many cities, but it just has not been able to really constrain and control police power, largely because it always comes after the fact, right? It responds to incidents after they have occurred. The idea is meant to say, if we figure out what went wrong in this incident, maybe we can prevent other incidents in the future. And there are some new ideas about civilian review. There's a pretty interesting book that recently came out called Cop. It's not a great title, but it's by a guy who worked on the Civilian Complaint Review Board in New York City, and he has some pretty interesting ideas for how to renovate and reconfigure civilian review to make it a bit more effective, basically to make it proactive rather than reactive. But in general, that just hasn't been how it has worked. And police unions have been extraordinarily effective at limiting both internal disciplinary mechanisms and these kind of external reviews, as well as criminal investigations. And I talk a lot in the book about some of the ways that police have been able to stymie these types of investigations and discipline mechanisms. And sometimes they do it through their contracts, sometimes they do it through state law. There have been efforts to introduce controls at the federal level that have not totally been successful. But police have always throughout this history been thinking about ways to stymie any type of external oversight or control.
Can you give us a short list towards the end of the book of the things we might learn from police labor organizing? And I think that your point about how officers, rank and file officers in command, how they sort of agree that this is not something that they're interested in doing, perhaps we might stop and consider pushing that idea again, knowing that then there are these two sides or hierarchy of officers who are absolutely going to join forces against it, is something I think really helpful that you give in the
Yeah, I would just say the book does emphasize a lot of fractures and divisions, but I don't want to give the false impression that they can't be overcome. Police consolidate and are able to, especially in moments of crisis, even if the week before they were at each other's throats within the department in a moment of crisis. They will come together and put aside their differences.
So last question, and this gets to the end of the book where Stuart tells us that the National Border Patrol Council becomes the first major police union to endorse Trump's run for the 2016 presidency. And you tell us a little bit about how the Border Patrol is a particular kind of policing, and suggest that, or I took away that moment suggested perhaps ideologically where we would have been heading as a nation, with Border Patrol supporting Trump. And we, I think, have a good idea of where we are now in that moment. And so maybe you can speak to the moment, but I'm also really interested in your thinking on cities in which officers have refused to cooperate in particular ways with federal agents and others that haven't. And how, I don't know, maybe I'm the only person hearing this, but folks who have long been critical of police for good reason are congratulating and appreciating their local officers for their refusal to participate. So there's this like, you were problematic, but because you're anti-ICE right now, you're okay, and we side with you. And it's this really kind of murky moment. What do you think about what's happening?
Well, I don't want to scoop myself too much for Tuesday night's panel, because I was going to talk about some of this. But I will say that the National Border Patrol Council has a kind of interesting inverse history from most of the police unions I talk about. So most police unions kind of gain power at the municipal level, figure out the state level, and then they join together with others to work at the federal level. Of course, the National Border Patrol Council, the Border Patrol is controlled by Congress, and its budget is authorized by Congress. So it had to figure out not how to gain access to Congress, because that was already kind of a given. It was how to leverage local situations for their own gain. So what they did was start to focus on quote-unquote immigrant crime, particularly in the borderlands, and get these kind of really xenophobic, immigration restrictionist type of people elected into Congress from the borderlands who could say, back home my constituents are getting murdered by illegal immigrants or whatever, and like they would say really wild and outrageous stuff. And that was the Border Patrol's kind of strategy, or the union's kind of strategy, to then ultimately expand the Border Patrol. And it was quite successful. And as you might know, the Border Patrol expanded from the 1990s into the 2000s. It became part of the Department of Homeland Security, which was created after September 11th. And then in Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill Act, the amount of resources for Border Patrol and ICE is just like unimaginable. They really don't know how to spend all the money that they've received. So in that sense, the trajectory is really one of the kind of success of Border Patrol as a kind of blue power actor. They would say green power, I guess, because their uniforms are green. But then you take Border Patrol out of the desert Southwest and you put them in cities like Minneapolis, and then you have ICE operating like Border Patrol. What does that mean? The way that ICE normally operates is in two ways. One, they take people out of jails who have already been detained, have what's called an immigration detainer, and they then put them into deportation proceedings or whatever. So it's basically a very boring logistical effort to just get somebody in handcuffs from a room to a van to another room. So that's one thing they do. And the other thing they do is what's called Homeland Security investigations, which are these somewhat sophisticated investigations where they develop probable cause, they get, they gather intelligence, blah, 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 and then they, try to arrest, in their minds, bad guys. What Border Patrol does is they just assume that anybody they encounter in the desert is a lawbreaker potentially a terrorist, especially after September 11th. They need no probable cause, they need no warrant, they can get away with basically anything, they engage in all kinds of brutality. So they're used to operating in the shadows, in the gullies in Arizona and Texas and so forth. So now you take them into the cities and they're operating the way that they would normally operate in the desert with like wanton brutality, and there's a million people with cell phone cameras watching them do this. Similarly, ICE, they're not used to just like walking up to people on the street and trying to effect arrests. That's just not what they are trained to do. They're trained to do these other types of operations. And so it became, as we saw over the last year, this just complete fiasco. And of course, the protest movements and mobilizations against them were, in many ways quite effective. They didn't necessarily completely stop deportation, but they certainly destroyed the legitimacy of these operations, and I think in many ways destroyed the legitimacy, the thread of legitimacy that the Trump administration even had. So, so you asked me about that, please. Okay. So, in some cases, what you saw in cities like Minneapolis, even in LA, you saw elected officials saying, what ICE is doing, what Border Patrol is doing is immoral, it's unlawful, it's racist, it's terrible. In contrast, our city police are not violating civil rights, they're not engaged in brutality, they're doing all the right things, they're protecting our citizens. And I think that the ultimate outcome of this is, on the one hand, the protest movement has made it so that these DHS thugs are seen as such, but the problem is that the police are looking seen in a somewhat more favorable light in comparison. And what they've been able to do, the evidence suggests so far, is that in some of these cities, they've been able to get what they want from the city council, from the mayor, because they're able to say, hey, look, we didn't do all that racist brutality stuff that ICE did. We have actually been fine, upstanding civil servants. And so, contracts coming up for negotiation, maybe you can add another, 0.8% on a raise or whatever, or you can do something else. And so I think that is a somewhat worrisome trend that is unexpected and is going to result from what we saw of Trump's surge across the country.
I didn't mean to end on a non-optimistic note, but we have the time from the back. So I wanted to say thank you so much, Stuart, for being here and for signing books, and for all of you for joining us on a really lovely Seattle day. To come down into a basement is like true solidarity. So if we could just give a round of applause to Stuart. Thank you.